Dean Martin spent decades as the most relaxed man in show business. A cigarette in one hand, a glass that looked like whiskey in the other, and a grin that made it seem like nothing in the world could touch him. Audiences called him the King of Cool. What most of them never saw was how much that ease cost him, or how quiet his final years actually were. This is the story of the man behind that smile, and of Jean Martin, the wife who spent a lifetime loving him, losing him, leaving him, and then never really letting go. Long before there was a Dean Martin, there was Dino Paul Crocetti, born June 7, 1917, in Steubenville, Ohio, a gritty steel town on the Ohio River. His parents were Italian immigrants. His father ran a barber shop, and Italian, not English, was the language spoken at home. Dino struggled in school because of it, and by the time he reached high school, he had dropped out, choosing the streets over the classroom. He worked whatever jobs came his way. A steel mill, a gas station, boxing under the name Kid Crochet, dealing cards in illegal gambling halls. It was in one of those smoky back rooms that he started singing between hands to entertain the gamblers. Someone noticed. He began performing under the stage named Dino Martini. Then, on the advice of a bandleader who told him the name needed to sound more American, he became Dean Martin. The transformation from Steel Town Kid to nightclub singer had begun, but the man underneath the new name never fully left Steubenville behind. Dean's personal life moved fast once his career did. In 1941, he married Elizabeth and Betty McDonald, a young woman from Pennsylvania who stood by him through the lean years of small clubs and uncertain paychecks. Together, they had 4 children: Craig, Claudia, Gail, and Deanna. But as Dean's fame grew through his partnership with comedian Jerry Lewis, the marriage deteriorated. Betty struggled with alcohol, and Dean was rarely home. The couple divorced in 1949, with Dean taking custody of the children, an unusual arrangement for the era. Barely a week after the divorce was finalized, Dean married Dorothy Jean Beager, a former Orange Bowl beauty queen he had met a year earlier at one of his shows. Jerry Lewis stood as best man. Jean stepped into a house that already had 4 children in it and, over the next several years, added 3 more of her own with Dean. Dean Paul, born in 1951, Richie, born in 1953, and Gina, born in 1956. She raised all 7 under one roof, a fact her own stepdaughter Deanna would later describe warmly in her memoir about growing up in that household. To the outside world, the Martins looked like the picture of Hollywood success. Glamorous parties, famous friends, a husband who seemed to have wanted everything. Inside the house, it was more complicated. Dean's touring schedule kept him away for long stretches, and his reputation for infidelity was an open secret in Hollywood circles, even if the press rarely printed it. Jean endured it for years. By the early 1970s, though, her patience had run out. In 1972, she filed for divorce, and the marriage that had lasted 24 years officially ended in 1973. What followed surprised almost everyone. Less than a month after the divorce, at 55 years old, Dean married a 26-year-old Beverly Hills salon receptionist named Catherine Hahn. He even adopted her young daughter. It was a short, turbulent marriage, and by 1976 it, too, had ended in divorce. Dean never remarried after that. In time, he and Jean found their way back to each other, not as husband and wife again, but as 2 people who had built a life together and couldn't quite finish letting go of it. They stayed close for the rest of his life. Professionally, the 1950s and 1960s were Dean's golden years. When he split from Jerry Lewis in 1956 after a decade as one of the most successful double acts in show business, critics assumed his career was finished. Instead, he reinvented himself as a solo singer and film actor, then found a second creative home in Las Vegas alongside Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. together with Peter Lawford and Joey Bishop. They became the Rat Pack, the most famous ensemble of entertainers of their generation, filling the Sands Hotel night after night with a mix of music, comedy, and effortless charisma. Dean's stage persona, the loose tie, the half-empty glass, the slow, boozy delivery, became one of the most recognizable acts in America. It was also largely a performance. Those close to him, including his own children, insisted for years that the glass in his hand was far more often apple juice than liquor, and that the drunk persona was a carefully built comic character rather than a documentary of his private habits. It worked so well that even his closest friends sometimes played along with the myth in public. That myth also became a kind of wall. Dean was, by most accounts, a private and somewhat guarded man who preferred quiet evenings at home to the after-hours parties his Rat Pack image suggested. He built a television institution, The Dean Martin Show, on his own unusual terms. No rehearsals, one day of filming a week, and eventual ownership of the program itself. A deal NBC reluctantly agreed to because his audience was simply too large to lose. The show ran for years and made him one of the most watched entertainers on American television. But behind the ease he projected on camera, friends and family described someone who kept his real feelings close and rarely let anyone all the way in. Whatever armor Dean Martin had built over 4 decades in public life was not enough for what happened on March 21st, 1987. His son, Dean Paul Martin Jr., a former professional tennis player, actor, and captain in the California Air National Guard, was killed when the fighter jet he was piloting crashed into Mount San Gorgonio during a snowstorm. He was 35 years old. It took search crews nearly a week to locate the wreckage in the mountains. Dean Paul had been, by every account, the son closest to his father's heart. Those who knew the family, said Dean never fully recovered from the loss. At the time, he had been preparing for a highly anticipated reunion tour with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., billed as the Together Again tour. He performed a handful of dates, visibly withdrawn and going through the motions, before leaving the tour early. Sinatra reportedly tried to talk him into continuing. Dean couldn't do it. In the years that followed, he stepped back almost entirely from the public eye. He rarely performed, avoided interviews, and spent much of his time out of the spotlight he had occupied for most of his adult life. Friends who visited him during this period described a man who had lost the energy and warmth that once defined him, someone content to sit quietly rather than perform for anyone, even those closest to him. Through all of this, Dean Martin remained close by. Even though their marriage had ended more than a decade earlier, she had never fully stepped out of his life, and after Dean Paul's death, she became one of the few people he allowed near him. She checked in on him, saw him socially, and was, by the account of people who knew the family, one of the steadiest presences in his life during those difficult final years. It was not a grand, dramatic reconciliation so much as two people who had shared decades of history quietly staying connected as one of them grieved. Dean's health declined steadily through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Decades of heavy smoking caught up with him, and he was eventually diagnosed with lung cancer. According to those close to him, he chose not to pursue aggressive treatment, telling friends he felt he had already lived a full life. He spent his final months largely at home, out of public view, a stark contrast to the man who had once filled Las Vegas showrooms and living rooms across America every week. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1995, at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 78. The official cause was acute respiratory failure related to emphysema. His death was met with an outpouring of tributes from a generation of entertainers who considered him not just a colleague, but a defining figure of an era. As a tribute, the lights along the Las Vegas Strip, including at the Sands, the Flamingo, and the Desert Inn, were dimmed for several minutes, an honor rarely extended to any performer. He was laid to rest at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, his crypt inscribed with a line from the song that became his signature, "Everybody loves somebody." Dean Martin never remarried. She continued to speak about Dean warmly in the years after his death, and remained a visible presence at tributes and events honoring his legacy, often alongside their children. She died of cancer in 2016 at the age of 89. Her death came only a few weeks after that of her younger son, Richie Martin, who was found dead at his Utah home earlier that same year, a devastating span of loss for a family that had already endured so much. Looking back at Dean Martin's life, what stands out is the gap between the performance and the person. On stage and on camera, he was the embodiment of effortless cool, a man who never seemed to try too hard at anything and always seemed to land on his feet. In private, he was someone who worked hard to make that ease look natural, who carried real grief quietly, and who, after losing his son, never fully found his way back to the man audiences thought they knew. Jean Beager Martin, the wife he married, divorced, and never entirely left behind, was there for much of that private story, a steady presence behind one of the most carefully constructed public images in American entertainment. Their marriage did not survive, but something between them clearly did. Whatever it was, loyalty, old love, simple familiarity built over decades. It kept her close to him when it mattered most in the quiet, difficult years most of his fans never saw at all.